I bought 14 of the most common sanders that are under $100 that most people are buying. We're gonna put them to the test and figure out which one is the best, or the best for most people. Now I'm gonna put them through a series of tests. We're gonna sand with them. We're gonna see how hot they get. We're gonna test the vibration, and we're gonna test the durability in case they fall off the workbench 3 times and see how they hold up. I purchased every one of these sanders myself. This is not sponsored. I bought them from Home Depot, Harbor Freight, and Amazon. I'll leave a link in the description below for all of these if you're interested in checking them out. First and foremost, unboxing everything. The only 3 that's coming with a bag or some type of carrying case are the Ridgid. One Makita comes with that, and then also the Milwaukee. But one of these Makitas come with a hard case, and I say one because I purchased 2, because when I purchased all of these, 2 Makitas were under $100. Now the one with the handle is slightly over $100, so we're gonna throw it in the mix. As far as size and weight goes, the Win is a pretty heavy sander, as well as the Makita with the handle on the front. And it has a weird kind of a trigger feel. I'm kind of curious to see how that feels when we sand with it. One of the heaviest sanders is the Hercules brand. It's pretty well balanced, but it is quite heavy if you're just picking this up. Now that may be a benefit once we start sanding with it. The Ridgid is kind of about the same weight as the Bosch, and then rounding up the heavier sanders is the Skil. All these other ones, they pretty much weigh the same. Now, a lot of times when you're in Harbor Freight, you'll see this Hercules brand, and they'll say compare to the DeWALT version XYZ, because they compare themselves to DeWALT a lot. And you can see they kind of look similar, but they're really not. However, one very interesting thing to me is this Craftsman looks identical to this DeWALT. I swear they come out of the same factory. I would probably make a bet on it because they both made in Mexico and they both look identical. The switch positions, the screw positions on top, even the side profiles, the way the bag connects, everything looks to be identical. The only thing that's different is the DeWALT has variable speed and the Craftsman does not. They both have 3-year warranties. The Craftsman's about $54 and the DeWALT is about $84. So about a $30 difference. And what I'm assuming all you're getting different is the variable speed. They weigh virtually the same, about an ounce difference according to my measurements. They both have the same size motor at 3 amps, and they both have the same stroke rate at about 3/32 of an inch. The Metabo has like a 12-foot long cord, so if that's important to you, then that'll be helpful in your shop. But the dust bag kind of goes on weird. It clips on the top and it pops off very easily. The Hercules, I'm kind of interested. This has got a 10-foot long cord. The cord on this one is much, much thinner than, say, the DeWALT or even the Milwaukees and all that. Like the gauge of the cord feels much less. It's a much heavier. This is one of the heavier sanders. I'm not sure how that'll translate into sanding, but it's very heavy. It may absorb some of that vibration. Almost no vibration in my hand. Kind of interesting. Very quiet too. The Skil, the one thing I'm not impressed with is this plastic thing. This is gonna break. I would almost put money on it. This is gonna break in the drop test. We'll see, but I'm not a fan of that. I would much prefer these little bags. The Skil is quiet. There's very little vibration. It almost feels underpowered. Just initial impressions, it feels very underpowered. The very popular Bosch, this is one of the most popular sanders out there, so I'm curious to see how it performs. I've never used this. I've always either had Festool or the DeWALT brand, or Hyper Tough if you go way back, but this is interesting to me. There's a significant amount of vibration in my hand with this one, and it sounds different in the inside. You can hear that higher pitched grindy sound, and it's just, it's interesting to me. This one will be interesting to use, I think. The Bauer, Black & Decker, Bosch, Hercules, Metabo, Milwaukee, Skil, and Win are all made in China. The Craftsman and DeWALT are both made in Mexico. Both of the Makitas are made in Japan. The Ridgid is made in Vietnam and the Ryobi in Thailand. All right, so I put sandpaper on each one of these and pulled it off to see which one stuck better coming straight out of the box. I'm using both Festool granite and Cubitron paper because they both kind of stick a little different. We'll do good, better, best. How about that? So the good, in other words, it really didn't stick all that great. Metabo, Ridgid, the cheaper of the Makitas and the Milwaukee all had mediocre at best sticking power as far as our hook and loop goes. Now the better of the options, the Win, the Bosch, the other Makita, the one with the front handle, and then also the Bauer did pretty well as far as holding the paper. Just put it on and off. Now the best, the ones that stuck to it the best, I actually had to put a little force on it to get it off. We're looking at the Skil, the Hercules, the Ryobi, the Black & Decker, the DeWALT, and of course, its brother, the Craftsman. They all stuck very well on those. If you like this type of content and you want to see more, go ahead and smash that subscribe button. Also click the bell icon and then select all so you get notified of all the new content I've got coming. So I took all of these sanders and I sanded with them each 15 minutes from start to finish, 15 minutes each times 14 sanders, and you got a whole lot of sanding. I alternated hands with each one, and it took me 2 days to do this. Just because I wanted to spread it out and make sure my hands weren't too fatigued. I'm using stock dust collection, in other words, the bag that comes on these sanders, just to get an idea of how they will perform under normal circumstances. I also have a thermal imager. We're going to see how hot these get on the base, in other words, the sanding pad, as well as around the hand area. During this 15-minute trial, I'm going to rate the hand fatigue, in other words, the numbness I feel in my hand, my upper arm or lower arm, from 1 to 5, 5 being the most extreme, like it's super numb, it hurts, and then 1 being the best. And that's the way we'll rank these. First up was the Bauer. The very first thing I noticed about the Bauer, it is extremely underpowered. When you put any pressure down, it stops. It just stops spinning, it just vibrates. None of the other sanders, well, one of the other sanders did this. The rest of them had plenty of power for normal sanding operations. The onboard dust collection I rated as poor, and I did notice that the sanding disc was fairly clogged up at the end of that 15 minutes. It got up to 101.6 degrees during this test, and that's not too hot, but it's also not the coldest in the group. As far as hand fatigue goes, I give it a 3. It wasn't really bad, but it also wasn't really great. When drop testing the Bauer, it cracked the dust container on after a couple of drops. You can see here where it's cracked, and well, just kind of the nature of the beast when you put a plastic container on something like this that's inevitably going to fall off a workbench. On the Black & Decker, this one reached a temperature of 110 degrees during the 15 minutes, which is fairly warm. This is one of the hotter of the two. I did notice that it had disappointing performance overall. It felt very weak. On the Black & Decker, this had a 4 in hand fatigue. It was extremely numb, just like the previous video I did with that sander. It has a lot of vibration in there. It's going to cause a lot of fatigue. The onboard dust collection, though, is very good on this sander. As you can see here, it collects most of the dust, and the sanding pad stayed relatively clean. Drop testing this Black & Decker. That sounded solid. There's 0 damage that I could tell. Everything still functions. After we were done, there's a little bit of road rash on there, but nothing major. The Bosch got up to 129 degrees during my testing, which is one of the hotter of the sanders. And if you know anything about heat and friction, it's the enemy of sanding. Your sanding disc won't last as long. And I thought that the Bosch was very underpowered, especially on first startup. It didn't want to spin. After everything got warmed up, it started spinning. The Bosch was probably the most disappointing tool in this lineup, only because I thought they were better. My overall opinion of Bosch was better. This was very disappointing. The hand fatigue was light. I rated this at a 2. I barely felt anything after 15 minutes of sanding, but the onboard dust collection was very poor. It even stopped up the sanding disc. I didn't have a whole lot in that container. Just overall disappointed in the Bosch sander. Drop testing the Bosch, it has a very similar container as the Bauer, but it performed a little better. I didn't have anything that cracked or broke. Of course, the top pops off, but it pops right back on. It's got a little road rash, but otherwise it fared well. Next up was a Craftsman. It got up to 105 degrees during my testing, which wasn't overall bad. But it also wasn't the greatest. The hand fatigue was at about a 2. I didn't feel a whole lot of numbness or stinging at all when I was done. I was pretty impressed with the Craftsman. And one of the reasons is the Craftsman and the DeWALT are the same sander, and I got similar results here. I'm gonna go ahead and group this in here too. The DeWALT did get a little warmer at 114 degrees versus the Craftsman at 105. The hand fatigue was extremely similar. I rated those at a 2 just because I didn't feel any numbness, very little numbness after 15 minutes. I put both of their onboard dust collections as fair. When you do hook these up to dust extraction or a shop vac, they perform much better. I know this from experience because of the DeWALT sander I've had for years. Interestingly enough, the sandpaper on the Craftsman was stopped up at the end of the 15 minutes, whereas on the DeWALT it was clean, which I thought was interesting since they're basically the same sander minus the variable speed on the DeWALT. Drop tested the Craftsman.
Ooh, that sounded solid.
You know, this thing sounds beefy when it hits the ground. It's a nice weight to it, and this performed well. Everything's still working after it dropped. Drop testing this brother, the DeWALT. Very similar results, no damage at all other than just a tiny bit of road rash from hitting the concrete. Still working. I've had this model sander for years, dropped it multiple times. I even broke a sink one time when I knocked it off the workbench. and had to pay for that. It was a customer order, another story for another day, but this one performed well. The Craftsman dust bag did come apart, and these 3 little bearings that keep it tight popped off, but I was able to reassemble it, so kind of a half and half. It damaged, but it's fixable, unless you lost the bearing. Now the Hercules, it is a very heavy sander, and it just feels heavier than the others, even though it's not the heaviest of the group. The Hercules got up to 129.2 degrees, which was the hottest of all of the sanders that I tested after 15 minutes. I had very harsh hand fatigue after using that. I rated it at a 4. It probably could have creeped up into the 5 area. It has a lot of vibration in that sander. The onboard dust collection was very poor. And I noticed when starting out with the Hercules that it was very aggressive. Like, you could see my hand moving. It's very hard to control. It's just a little too aggressive for a finished sander, in my opinion. And after sanding for 15 minutes, because of the onboard dust collection being poor, the whole sandpaper was clogged up. But that also could be contributed to some of the heat buildup, as well as this baking that sawdust into that sanding disc. And I will make a note that I used brand new paper on every one of these sanders, so that's 14 pieces of the nice 3M Cubitron paper. We didn't go cheap here. Drop testing the Hercules, I had no issues dropping this. It performs well. It's a really heavy sander, so when it hits the concrete, man, it makes a thud. So this thing is like a brick. Overall, it still worked after dropping it. For the Makita #1 with the rear and front handle, this thing, as soon as I started, it started shocking me when I was holding the back. This is the only sander of the group that was shocking me at all. This could shock me consistently every time my hand was on this back part. If I kept it up here on the top, it was perfectly fine. At the end of the 15 minutes, it was 107 degrees. The hand fatigue on this double handle sander is just fair. I rated it at a 2. I didn't have a whole lot of fatigue at all. It absorbed the vibration well. The dust collection on board is really good, and the overall performance of the sander itself did well. The sanding disc is a little bit clogged up, but again, could be contributed to some of that heat buildup. But the worst offender is that shock, and it was a significant shock, not just a tingle. Makita #1 I thought would actually break something because of this handle sticking out, but it absorbed the impact. Nothing broke, nothing stopped working. It's still working. Makita #2, the regular no-handle sander. It got up to 111 degrees during my testing, and that showed up again on that sanding disc that was completely clogged over. The heat is a big factor there. Hand fatigue on this one, I rated it a 3 because I did start feeling a little bit of numbness after 15 minutes. The dust collection on board, though, was fair. There was quite a bit in here, but not as much as I would like, mainly because of this stopped-up disc, prevented it from collecting that dust. Makita #2 worked just as well. Dropping it, never saw any damage at all. It's still working after it drops. The Metabo got up to 107 degrees. I had very little hand fatigue at 2. The dust collection on this thing was very poor. The sanding disc was completely clogged. It felt smooth while I was operating, but I had very little hand fatigue. And I can't hate this dust bag more. I hate the way this connects to the sander. It pops off too easy. I just don't like this design. It just doesn't function well. Job tested the Metabo. This thing, every time you drop it or bump it or anything, this stupid bag flies off. I literally hate this bag. Next up was the Milwaukee. Now it did get fairly hot at 119 degrees, but it didn't bake onto this sanding pad, and it had very good dust collection compared to some of the other ones. I considered it actually the best out of the bunch as far as dust collection goes, and my hand fatigue was the best out of these. I rated it at a 1. I had no fatigue at all after 15 minutes, which kind of surprised me. I really wasn't expecting that based on my initial impressions of this Milwaukee out of the box. And as you can see by the bottom, there's very little dust collected on this sanding disc. Drop testing the Milwaukee, other than the top popping off and the dust going everywhere, it fared well. Nothing broke. The canister's still intact. It's a better plastic, I think, than what was on the Bosch. Overall, I'm not a fan of these plastic containers, but it fared well in the drop test. Next up was a Ridgid. It didn't get overly hot. It only got up to about 97 degrees. Hand fatigue was a 2. It wasn't bad at all. I've had very little numbness at all after 15 minutes. The onboard dust collection was pretty good, and the sanding disc was not stopped up at all after 15 minutes. This one performed pretty well overall. Drop testing the Ryobi and the Ridgid had very similar results. Neither one of those sustained any damage at all. Next up is the Ryobi. It performed very similar to the Ridgid, which really isn't surprising, all coming from TTI, but it got up to 97.7 degrees. The hand fatigue on this one was quite a bit worse. I gave it a 4. It was quite significant at the end of 15 minutes as far as the vibration goes and the way it felt in the hand. However, the dust collection was pretty good on this, very similar to that of the Ridgid, and the sanding disc was clean after 15 minutes. The Skil got up to 118.5 degrees. The hand fatigue was mediocre at 3, so we're about middle of the road there. The dust collection was very bad on this. I don't like this canister either, much like the Metabo bag. And during the drop test, it broke and it just won't go back on correctly. And it's just, you can force it on, but it doesn't go back on like it used to. And I also noticed when using the Skil that a lot of the dust was landing on my hand and was airborne. It wasn't actually being pushed into this canister. This canister is a sealed type canister where these bags and things have a little air to let things flow, and these type just don't work well in my opinion. The wind got up to 104.3 degrees after 15 minutes. The hand fatigue was the worst out of all of them, and I'll rate this at a 5. My hand was extremely numb and stinging after those 15 minutes. It also had the worst dust collection of any of them. You can see the dust was just basically being pushed up through that filter and being airborne. And the way this connects on the back, it's kind of a proprietary design. There's no way to hook up a shop vac or anything like that. And during the drop test, the canister actually broke on like the first or second drop. So this is not a very durable sander.
So the piece that keeps this on right there broke off. And so now this dust thing won't lock on there. So it's completely useless. That happened on the very first drop.
It's just not an overall performer in my opinion. And I'm typically a fan of wind tools, but this one. So I wanted to hook this up to a dust extractor to see how much difference that actually makes when sanding, and I chose the Bosch because it was one of the hotter of the previous ones at 129 degrees after 15 minutes. So I sanded again for 15 minutes with the dust extractor, and the temperature reading was 102, just over 102. So we reduced the temperature by 27 degrees just because we had a dust extractor. And you'll notice that the sanding pad is completely clean other than a little buildup on the very, very edge in one little spot. But it's much better improvement versus when we didn't have a dust extractor. So any of these sanders will likely be benefited by a dust extractor or a shop vac if you're able to connect the hose. But like the Wind and some of those that have the square connections, you're gonna have to find an adapter kit to make them work, and it's just gonna be more trouble. But they are available. I'll drop a link in the description below to the adapter kits that I recommend. So I'll rank these from worst to first based on the performance and the overall experience in using these throughout the last few days. We may have some different opinions on here depending on what you have. It's not a knock against your brand. It's just my personal experience and how I feel about them after using them. 3 really surprised me to end up in the worst category, and that is the long handle Makita. Because of the way it was shocking me, it has to go in the back of the line. And also the other Makita, just because of how bad this dust collection is and that tiny little sanding port, you're gonna have a hard time adapting that, I think, and I just didn't care for that. The Wind broke and the Skil broke on drops, as well as they just didn't perform well overall. The Ryobi had so much hand fatigue, I can't recommend it. The Bosch was probably the most disappointing because I've heard so much good things about the Bosch. It's just so underpowered. It doesn't compare to any of the other ones as far as the power of just spinning the disc. And then the Hercules and Bauer ended up here just because of poor performance and poor dust collection. And overall, the heft of this Hercules is really significant. And they both have proprietary dust connections, and that's going to make it hard to adapt things as well. I've got 2 middle of the road picks here, the Ridgid and the Black & Decker. The only drawback to the Black & Decker, in my opinion, is that hand fatigue. It is significant, but otherwise it performs well, and I've used it for a little while now here in the shop, and the only reason it's in the middle of the road, it is a good budget pick if you're on a budget, and it performs well other than the hand fatigue. The Ridgid performed well. It's a variable speed sander. It collected the dust well, and it just overall was a decent choice. But the price at $79 based on the performance is why I put it in the middle. Now I did pick 3 that goes in the top, I think is the top picks for most people. We got kind of a budget pick, and then we have the 2 kind of the upper end picks, basically buy once, cry once type things, even though these are all under $100. The Milwaukee performed extremely well. It's probably one of the better performing sanders, but it is one of the more expensive sanders at about $89 at the time of this filming. And one thing that put it over the top for me was the fact that they did include an adapter. Because they have that square port, they did include an adapter so you can hook up shop vacs and dust extractors. That's going to make it much easier. And it's a variable speed, and it just overall performed well, had the best dust collection and the best hand fatigue of the bunch. The Craftsman and DeWALT are basically the same sander. The DeWALT has the variable speed, and I think that is beneficial. The DeWALT is one I would actually recommend for most people because of all the features it has, the standard size dust extraction. It did well in the test. When you hook these up to dust extraction, they performed extremely well and they hold up well over time. I've had one for many, many years. And if you're on a bit of a budget and you don't really care about the variable speed, the Craftsman is the way to go. It's a well-performing sander and it just worked well. It's the exact same thing as the DeWALT, so you're getting a good sander with the Craftsman name on it. Because of our channel members and patrons, I'm able to buy these type tools and do these type videos to figure out what's best for most people. Thank you for all your support. And because of that, I'm going to give each one of these away to one of our channel members and patrons. That'll be announced on the Patreon page or the channel member community tab. If you're not one of our patrons or channel members and you would like to support us in that way, there'll be details in the description below. If you like this video, you'll love the parallel clamp test I did very similar to this. Put them all through the test, drop them, make sure to find the best one for you. Click that box right there to go watch that video. Click in the box, get you the big old virtual fist bump. Also, another one of my favorite videos right there.